Hi again, everybody. This is lecture 4 of St. Paul to the Romans, and we're looking at today chapters 4 and 5. And today we're still at Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Church at Henley Beach, and I'm standing in the sanctuary now, and behind me is the processional cross that's placed in a beautiful setting on the wall, and it stays there during Mass. So, in chapter 4, Paul wants to show us that Scripture itself strongly backs up what he's saying about faith. Faith in God and not keeping the law is what justifies us. Paul's going to argue from Genesis that it's Abraham who's the greatest figure of faith, the paradigm for a person of faith. It's precisely his extraordinary faith in God that justifies him. And it's not the fact that he was also considered a model of humble obedience to God and to God's laws. After chapter 4, moving into chapter 5, we'll notice a mood change. Because we're going to look now, having looked at what justifies us, at what the Christian life is all about. What does it mean to live a Christian life for those who have been justified by faith? It's a life in the Spirit. So our focus from chapter 5 on is not so much on the primacy of faith for our relationship with God, for our justification. Rather, the focus is going to be on hope. Hope for living our Christian life with all its challenges. It's hope and love which will especially dominate chapters 5 to 8. I'm going to look at 3 things in this presentation. Firstly, chapter 4, where we're going to look primarily at Abraham as the wonderful example of faithful man, of a believer. Then, just the introduction to the next section from chapters 5 to 8. The first 11 verses are going to introduce us to the new life for believers. And then from chapter 5 verses 12 to 21, we're going to look at something quite interesting. The legacy of Christ far outweighs the legacy of Adam. So first off, Abraham, the exemplar of faith. All of chapter 4. Paul wants to tell his Jewish Christian readers that Scripture confirms the primacy of faith over keeping the law. He's going to quote both the law and the prophets. The law, Genesis chapter 15, is going to talk about Moses. It's written by Moses, so that's going to support what he says. And then we're going to look at a psalm, which is going to support a prophetic, because the psalms are written by King David. So we've got Moses and King David. Moses, the law; King David, a prophet. That's in the Jewish mentality. Both are going to support what Paul says. And his greatest choice, of course, is of Abraham as the exemplar. Not just because he is the ancestor of the Jewish people, but because, in the words of, again, the wonderful Brendan Byrne, the stance that Abraham took before God, the choices he made, and the promises he received remain determinative or crucial or a real paradigm for all of his descendants and for the nation as a whole. You can't define Israel, especially the glorious Israel of the Messianic age, without defining Abraham and what it means to be among his descendants. Let's listen to how Abraham was seen in Jewish tradition. In the book of Ecclesiasticus, book of Sirach, we read, Abraham was the great father of a multitude of nations, and no one has been found like him in glory. He kept the law of the Most High and was taken into a covenant with him. He established the covenant in his flesh, and when he was tested, he was found faithful. When he was tested, remember the great test in Genesis chapter 22, when he had to sacrifice his only child, Isaac. Therefore, God assured him by an oath that the nations would be blessed through his posterity, that he would multiply him like the dust of the earth and exalt his posterity like the stars. That comes to us from the book of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. Well, Paul's going to challenge this a bit. It won't be because Abraham kept God's law, nor because he passed the test that God blesses him. Rather, it's because Abraham shows extraordinary faith in God. That's why he received blessings. And he's going to turn to chapter 15 of the book of Genesis and exegete that for us in a masterful way. In verse 3 and the following of Genesis 15, God promises Abraham a son and descendants as numerous as the stars. In verse 16 it goes, Abraham put his faith in God, and this faith was reckoned as justifying him. So Paul, of course, quotes that particular phrase. The word reckoned provides a verbal link with the next quotation from Psalm 32. Blessed is the one whom the Lord reckons as sinless. Using quotations with a significant word in one context and then another was a way that Jewish rabbis sought to deepen their understanding of Scripture. So it's faith in God that justifies. It's God who counts us sinless. Paul goes on to say that because the story of Abraham's faith and then of God's promise of blessing in Genesis 15 comes before the story of the covenant God makes with Abraham and circumcision in Genesis chapter 17, it's prior. It's more fundamental. Abraham is primarily the father of all believers, of all the uncircumcised or Gentiles, and only then, secondarily, 2 chapters later, is he father of the Jewish nation. Abraham believed in God before he was circumcised, and it's his faith in God that sealed his relationship with God, not any obedience to the law. From verse 13 onwards, Paul then argues that it's Abraham's faith in God's first promise, the first of 2 promises in Genesis 15, the promise about having descendants, that not only leads to Abraham's righteousness, but entitles all his descendants to enter into the blessings of salvation. In Jewish tradition, these blessings that were promised to Abraham and his descendants were explained by the second promise, which was the promise about land. Abraham's descendants were to receive the promised land, which they would possess forever.